She stepped out into the cold desert night, free but uncertain, the firelight fading behind her. A lone cowboy had risked everything to save her, not as a prize, but as a human being deserving dignity. For the first time, she felt trust, courage, and hope. In the endless Wild West, two souls discovered freedom and respect. Let's get started. The saloon thundered with noise, laughter, piano keys striking off key, and the clinking of whiskey glasses, but Samuel's eyes were fixed on the small wooden stage in the corner. There she stood, an Apache girl, wrists bound with rough rope, her eyes flashing anger and fear all at once. The crowd cheered for a cruel game, and the showman's grin was wide and malicious. "Hit all 6 bottles and she's free," he yelled. Samuel's stomach twisted. Freedom? From a man who treated it as a challenge? Still, he picked up the rifle, steadying his hands. "I'll play," he said quietly. The first bottle shattered with a sharp crack, cutting through the noisy saloon like a knife. Samuel felt every eye on him, the weight of expectation and judgment pressing down. He kept his gaze on the girl, whose expression didn't change, proud, defiant, and wary. She had been through too much, and he swore silently that she would leave with dignity intact. The second bottle fell, and the crowd's cheers grew, but Samuel ignored them. This wasn't about applause or winning a prize. It was about righting a wrong, about giving someone a chance at freedom she deserved. By the third bottle, his pulse had steadied. He could see the muscles in his arms, working in rhythm with his breath, feel the wood of the rifle under his fingers. The girl's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, as if she realized someone here cared more about justice than spectacle. He could not speak, could not announce himself as a hero. There was no honor in shouting over the crowd. He had to move with precision, focus on each bottle, each moment, and block everything else. The fourth bottle shattered, a tiny explosion of glass, and the showman's grin faltered. Samuel's hand didn't shake, though the pressure of the room threatened to unbalance him. He thought of the world outside, the harsh sun over the plains, the wide desert, the endless struggle of survival. And he thought of the girl, standing still, watching, waiting. Her defiance was remarkable, a quiet rebellion against a cruel system that treated her like an object. She deserved more than the game. She deserved respect, safety, a chance to live free. His hands were steady, though his heart raced. Because this was about something far bigger than bottles on a shelf. The fifth bottle teetered for a heartbeat before shattering, sending shards skittering across the wooden stage. The crowd gasped, the showman's laughter quieting, tension hanging in the air like smoke. Samuel lowered the rifle, took a deep breath, and focused. The last bottle glinted in the light, small and fragile, like a life itself dangling in the balance. He exhaled slowly, steadied his aim, and pulled the trigger. Glass exploded in a sparkling shower, and the room went silent for a long, heavy beat. Then the showman's voice broke the silence. "She's free," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Samuel didn't answer. He strode forward, untying the ropes binding her wrists, careful to avoid touching her more than necessary. She did not flinch, but she did not step forward immediately. Her eyes met his, and in them was a storm of gratitude, skepticism, and cautious hope. "You don't have to follow me," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I'm not here to follow. I'm here to make sure you get out safely." Outside the saloon, the night air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush across the plains. Samuel led her away from the crowd, who had mostly dispersed, leaving only the clatter of a distant piano and the faint smell of whiskey behind them. She walked beside him, silent but steady, not because she owed him anything, but because for the first time in days she felt safe. The stars stretched wide above the desert, endless and free, and in that quiet moment, Samuel understood the gravity of his choice. Freedom was a gift, not a game. The journey back to his cabin was slow, deliberate, each step measured to keep her calm and unafraid. She glanced at him occasionally, curiosity flickering in her eyes, but she said nothing of her past, and he asked nothing. Words were not necessary. Respect and caution were. When they reached the cabin, he opened the door and gestured inside. She stepped in, allowing herself to breathe, to rest, to know that the world could be kind. Outside, the desert was harsh and endless. But inside, for the first time in her life, she found quiet safety. By the firelight, she removed her coat and set it carefully aside, her movements deliberate. Samuel prepared a small meal without speaking, letting her adjust to the warmth of the cabin. She sat near the hearth, eyes reflecting the flickering flames, shoulders easing with every passing moment. This was not about ownership or winning or prizes. It was about trust, earned slowly in small gestures, the kind of trust that could heal wounds deeper than any rope or cruelty could inflict. As the night deepened, they sat together in silence, two figures shadowed by the fire, each respecting the other's space. She finally spoke, voice low. "Why did you do it?" Samuel shook his head, not wanting to reduce his actions to simple words. "Because no one should ever be treated like a prize," he said. Her eyes softened and she nodded once, slowly. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. He realized then that courage was not just in pulling the trigger, it was in standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. By the time dawn broke, the girl had slept beside the fire, wrapped in a blanket Samuel had given her. The desert light filtered through the window, illuminating her calm, steady breathing. She was free, and he had kept his promise, safety, respect, and dignity. Outside, the world remained harsh, but in that cabin, a quiet trust had been forged, stronger than fear, stronger than cruelty, stronger than the night that had once threatened to consume them both. The saloon had fallen into a tense hush, the kind that made every movement sound louder than it should. Samuel's hands gripped the rifle, knuckles white, as he took aim at the first bottle. The Apache girl's gaze didn't waver. She stood with silent dignity, defiance burning in her eyes. The crowd's jeers and laughter faded to a low murmur as the first shot cracked through the air. Glass shattered, scattering fragments across the stage. Every eye in the room was fixed on him, but Samuel saw only her and the promise that she would walk free tonight. The second bottle flew apart under his steady aim. The showman's smug grin faltered, replaced by unease. Samuel's heart pounded, not from the pressure of the crowd, but from the knowledge of what was truly at stake. She was not a prize to be claimed, not a spectacle for entertainment. She was a person, and the cage at her wrist symbolized a cruelty that needed to end. His hands remained steady. With each pull of the trigger, Samuel felt a responsibility heavier than any rifle, heavier than the applause that followed every shattered bottle. The third shot rang out, precise and controlled. The girl's expression shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible easing of tension, a flicker of trust. Samuel could see the gratitude in her eyes, even though her posture remained proud and unyielding. The saloon, once roaring with laughter and cheers, had grown silent. Patrons leaned forward, uncertain if they were witnessing a contest or a rescue. Samuel ignored them entirely, focusing solely on the row of bottles before him. One by one he shattered them, each shot echoing in the cavernous space, bringing him closer to the goal that mattered most, her freedom. By the time the fourth bottle exploded, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the strain in his arms, the pull of concentration against fatigue, but his resolve did not waver. Outside the windows, the desert night was cold and silent, but inside the cabin-like saloon, all eyes were riveted on this quiet act of defiance. The girl did not flinch or speak, only watched him with steady eyes that dared anyone to treat her as less than human. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. This moment was far more than a game. It was justice, courage, and hope all rolled into one. The fifth bottle clinked and shattered with ease. A few patrons whispered, the crowd uncertain whether to cheer or recoil at the scene unfolding. The showman's confident smirk had faded entirely, replaced with tight-lipped tension. Samuel lowered his sights briefly, exhaled, and readied himself for the last bottle. The girl shifted slightly, not out of fear, but as though acknowledging the effort he was making, not for glory, but for her freedom. Her trust was tentative, fragile, and yet it was enough. Samuel understood then that courage could not be measured by shots fired or applause, but by the choices made when lives hung in the balance. The final bottle sat there, unshaken, glinting in the dim saloon light like a beacon. Samuel's hands were steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He aimed, focused, and pulled the trigger. Glass shattered into sparkling fragments that flew across the wooden stage. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that makes every small sound of breathing and movement impossible to ignore. The crowd stayed frozen, unsure what had just occurred. But Samuel didn't care. He had completed what mattered. The girl's safety, her dignity, her freedom, these were the only victories he sought. Samuel strode to the cage, key in hand, and unlocked the rough iron door. She stood tall, not running or bowing, simply waiting. "You're free," he said softly, not as a claim but as a promise. Her eyes met his for a long moment, a mixture of relief, caution, and gratitude. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she stood beside him outside the stage, breathing the night air as if it had never touched her before. No words were needed. The quiet understanding between them spoke louder than the cheers that slowly rose behind them. They walked out into the desert night together, the stars overhead stretching infinitely. The crowd faded behind them, the music and laughter nothing more than a distant memory. Samuel kept a steady pace, glancing occasionally at her, noting the slight easing of tension in her shoulders. The cage, the showman, the spectacle, none of it mattered anymore. Freedom was not given as a prize, it was earned, and she had claimed it simply by surviving, by trusting the right person to stand beside her when it mattered most. By the time they reached the edge of the small town, she finally spoke. "Why did you do that?" she asked, voice soft but steady. Samuel shook his head, looking out across the plains. "Because no one deserves to be treated like an object," he said. She nodded slowly, taking in his words, understanding without needing further explanation. They walked on in silence, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust across the desert, a quiet promise of new beginnings stretching out before them. Dawn found them sitting atop a small hill overlooking the valley, the sun rising in a wash of gold and rose. She unbound her hair, letting it flow free in the morning breeze. Samuel handed her a flask of water, and she drank slowly, then looked at him with a faint smile. "I've never felt safe before," she whispered. Samuel offered only a quiet nod. There was no need for words. Her freedom, her dignity, and the trust she now placed in him said more than language ever could. The saloon, the cruel challenge, and the showman were far behind them now, meaningless compared to the open plains stretching ahead. Samuel understood then that true courage was not measured by aim, or skill, or applause. It was measured by the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when others watch, jeer, or challenge your every move. She had survived, and together they had walked into a new dawn, one where respect, freedom, and hope could finally thrive. The desert night stretched endlessly before them, stars glittering cold and distant above the horizon. Samuel led her carefully across the dry sand, boots crunching softly, making sure each step was steady. She followed, silent but attentive, wary of sudden movements or hidden dangers. The saloon behind them faded into the distance, the music and shouting replaced by the quiet sigh of the wind through sagebrush and scrub. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: safety. Every cautious step reinforced it. Freedom, she realized, was not just escaping chains, it was being treated with respect. She glanced over at him, uncertain how to measure the man who had risked so much to save her. Samuel's expression was calm, focused, but not cold. He did not gloat, nor did he seek praise. His actions were deliberate, measured, and selfless. "You could have walked away at any time," she murmured, voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't you?" He looked out over the horizon, the moon casting pale light over the desert hills. "Because some things can't be ignored," he said quietly. "Some people shouldn't be left to suffer when you have the means to help." The wind picked up, whistling across the plains, tugging at their clothes and hair. She hugged her coat tightly, feeling the chill in her bones, yet a warmth lingered in her chest she hadn't known in years. Samuel noticed the small tremble and offered a flask of water. "Drink," he said. "It helps." She accepted it cautiously, her fingers brushing against his only briefly before pulling back. Even in small gestures, she felt the difference between fear and safety. For a moment, the desert seemed less hostile, less endless. It became a place where courage and humanity could exist. They paused at a small rise, overlooking the town and surrounding desert. Below, lights flickered faintly from scattered homes, shadows stretching across the sand. She knelt and touched the ground lightly, as if sensing the earth beneath her feet could now hold her. "It feels different," she said softly. Samuel nodded, letting her find the words herself. "Freedom isn't always loud," he replied. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just knowing you can walk through the night and no one can touch you without your say." She breathed deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing. Samuel walked beside her slowly, careful not to overstep, careful to let her choose the pace. He could see her eyes scanning the horizon, assessing the dangers and opportunities, but not with the terror she had arrived with. She was learning to trust slowly, and he understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Every careful glance, every hesitant smile, every quiet moment she allowed him near was a victory far greater than any applause from a saloon crowd. This was the beginning of something stronger than chains, cruelty, or games. The night air was crisp and dry, carrying the smell of sage and sand. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and awe. "You really didn't have to step in," she said quietly. "I could have." Samuel cut her off gently. "You shouldn't have to face that alone," he said. "You didn't ask for this life, but you deserve better than it." Her chest tightened at the words, tears welling briefly in her eyes. She looked at him, really looked, and realized that some strangers could be allies in ways she hadn't thought possible. As they continued walking, the desert opened before them in vast stretches of sand, scrub, and rolling hills. Samuel slowed, letting her take the lead for a while. Her small footsteps were hesitant but deliberate, the first true movements of autonomy she'd felt in weeks. I don't know what comes next," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head gently. "Doesn't matter yet. One step at a time. Tonight you're safe. That's enough for now." She nodded, letting herself believe it, the weight of fear and exhaustion easing from her shoulders. They finally reached a small creek, its water glinting faintly under the moonlight. She knelt to touch it, letting the cool water run over her hands. "I haven't felt this calm in years," she whispered. Samuel stood a few paces away, hands resting on his rifle, not as a threat but as a reassurance. "Calm is earned," he said quietly. "And you've earned it by surviving, by staying strong, by trusting someone when it mattered most." She smiled faintly, not with glee, but with relief, understanding that her life had shifted toward something new and unbroken. Hours passed as they found a small, hidden ravine to rest, away from the desert's harshness and the town's prying eyes. She huddled under a blanket, watching the stars above, each one a reminder of the vastness of the world and the potential for freedom. Samuel sat nearby, silent, observing her with quiet vigilance. No words were necessary. Her safety was his duty, and her peace his satisfaction. The night stretched long and still, but it was not empty. It was filled with the promise of autonomy, choice, and dignity. By dawn, the first light crept over the horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and rose. She stood, brushing sand from her coat, taking in the view with renewed clarity. Samuel remained near, not hovering, but offering reassurance by his mere presence. "The world looks different now," she said softly. "Different, yes," he replied, "and it will keep changing. But tonight you walked free. That's what matters." She nodded, understanding the depth of his words. Freedom, safety, and respect could not be won. They had to be lived. The final moments of night saw them moving slowly back toward a safe path leading out of the open desert. She glanced over her shoulder at the town, at the shadows of the saloon, and then back at Samuel. "I don't know your name," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I didn't save you for praise or recognition. I did it because it was right. You'll remember that as you move forward." She smiled faintly, a mixture of gratitude and quiet strength forming in her expression. For the first time, she felt truly untethered. They continued walking together as the sun rose fully over the plains, bathing the desert in warm light. Samuel felt a rare peace settle over him, the kind that comes only when one has acted justly and with courage. She in turn felt a newfound confidence. The night had been long and fear had stalked every step, but it had ended. She was free to choose, free to walk into the morning on her own terms, and free to believe that the world, though harsh, could harbor kindness and justice.